For those of you who didn't make it here at 10 a.m. for our opening, I'll introduce myself again. I'm Nicholas DiMoncho, Director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, interdisciplinary center here on the Berkeley campus, bridging 25 departments across 7 schools of the university, and interested precisely in the kinds of collisions between past and future and the multiple frames of intellectual reference that we're here to talk about today. So I welcome you to our second of 3 panels, and I will invite the moderator of that panel to come up and frame the discussion, and rather I will invite Rebecca Levitan, co-organizer of this conference, to come up and present the second panel and get us going.
Okay, so welcome back. I should say I was threatened by one of my undergraduate students that if I did not talk about gender, race, and representation in virtual archaeology and landscape architecture, she would ask a question. And I would like to say we have a lot of work to do in all of those fields, but I'm very happy about the number of very interesting and amazing women who are presenting at this event today. And it is my privilege, and I'm very excited to introduce Jen Steger, who will be our next moderator. So Jen spent a childhood laboring on an archaeological dig in the Middle East, and this honed her interest in the stories we tell about material remains and prompted her to pursue a PhD in the history of art, which she received here at UC Berkeley in 2012. During that time, she completed fellowships at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts and the Getty Research Institute, as well as extensive travel. Jennifer's primary area of research is the ancient Mediterranean and its art in a global context. Since returning to San Francisco in the fall of 2013, she's focused on writing in publications like Art Practical, teaching at UC Berkeley, and we've actually taught together, as well as the City College of San Francisco. She was one of the curators of the exhibit Picasso and Rivera at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and I'm very happy to say that as of this week, she's accepted a job at Johns Hopkins University. So join me in welcoming Jennifer, who will be moderating our next panel.
Hello. Welcome to the afternoon and to previous pasts, accessing history through drawings, plans, casts, and copies. I'm going to just shepherd us straight into the first talk because I'm expecting a very animated conversation between the 3 panelists who have, as David said to me, been empaneled before, but who know each other and have known each other's work and worked collaboratively together in the past. So I'm expecting some intense discussion when we get to that point. It's my pleasure to introduce David Gissen of California College of the Arts. David is the author of books, essays, exhibitions, and experimental writings and projects about environments, landscapes, cities, and buildings from our time and the historical past. A professor at the California College of the Arts, a visiting professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology History, Theory, Criticism program, and a visiting critic at numerous schools in the United States and in Europe. David lectures and teaches in the areas of architecture, urban and landscape history, theory, preservation, writing, and design. At CCA, he co-directs the Experimental History Project and this almost makes me want to go back for another degree, the MAD HTX degree. Currently, he's developing a critical environmental history of the reproduction of global cultural artifacts, objects, images, texts, and audio in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Simultaneously, he's developing environmental reproduction and environmental translation, techniques that can represent aspects of the spatial and environmental histories and qualities of artifacts within a reproduction. And more personally, David and I have begun a collaboration that we will maybe get to in the Q&A, loosely called the Copy Shop, but which engages in the possibilities of material reproductions of historical objects. Okay, David Gissen.
Thanks, Jen, for that great intro. Thank you, Nicholas and Rebecca, for having me here today. It's an honor to be here and to be back with Adam and Brendan as well. So I'm going to commit the sin of reading because this is a very new project for me, and I want to be a little careful about how I'm using language to describe it. So my talk today is drawn from a very current research project called the Environmental Reproduction of Cultural Artifacts, and I'm examining how environmental qualities such as brightness and darkness, chromaticity, contrast, noise, reverberation, and frequency have been and can be then reproductions of painting, sculpture, performance, and text represent ideas about space, time, and subjectivity. You can basically describe this in a very brief sentence and say it's an environmental history of modern reproductions. So in tandem with historical and theoretical writing on this topic, it also entails my work with institutions like the V&A and my lab at the California College of the Arts to explore novel reproductions of cultural artifacts and expand what we think is possible in their representational capacities, particularly as it relates to environmental history. So today, I want to briefly introduce you to some areas of this exploration. I'll provide a very brief introduction to some concepts within histories of reproductions of cultural artifacts drawn from my own work and others, as well as looking a little bit at how we imagine reproducing the environments of artifacts in museological contexts. And then I'll show you one of my own environmental reproductions as it relates a bit to this history. So I always think about what I'm going to use as a case study to talk about reproductions, and I'm told I'm speaking to a room in which there are several world experts in Greek antiquity. So if I describe the history of this particular object in any way that's incorrect, I apologize in advance, but I'm using it as an example because there are so many different reproductions of this. So I like to think of reproductions as translations of models versus copies of originals. For example, when we go to a figure drawing class of a human being, we don't look at the human being in the figure drawing class as an original and our drawings as copies, they're translations. And I think it's a more apt and relativist way to think about this particular relationship. And I'm going to use this statue you see here to illustrate some of that thinking. So this was excavated on the Athenian Acropolis in the late 19th century. It's come to be known by a somewhat awkward name, the Blonde Boy, because of the yellow ochre paint found in the sculpting of its hair. And here the model, what was dug up, is on the left. And there's two reproductions of it on the middle and to the right, a plaster cast from the early 20th century and a photograph from the mid 20th century. So both the plaster cast and the photograph represent and gain their, the statue and gain their veracity by being forms of what I like to think of as indexical realism. And that's a fancy way to say that we sense that someone was in proximity to this model by either pressing a mold against it, right, the word cast, or somehow being before it with the photographic representation that you see on the right. And as I mentioned, the sculpture is noted for its polychromy, but that's found in the hair and the eyes, but all three images have a completely different color sense. The color photo shows you some traces of the color in the eyes. The plaster cast, of course, in this case, eliminates the coloration of the marble material completely. And curiously, among these three images, the color sense of the statue is actually strongest in the black and white image. So while this is likely due to the care of the artifact over time, I think it can suspend some of our preconceptions regarding the ability of black and white photography to communicate color. Black and white photography can't communicate wavelengths of color, but it can communicate the concept of color, in this case, sometimes better than a color photograph can. So, and some of you may notice, I'm not sure of the resolution on this projector, but some of you may notice something a little unusual about the photograph on the right. Yes. Oh, I don't know how to do that from up here. Is that within my... Okay, all right, okay. Anyway, so the photograph on the right actually has a fragment, blurry, of a building behind it, the Erechtheion in the Acropolis. So in 1939, the German art historian Ernst Langlotz, a student of Heinrich Wölfflin, created a series of photographs of the Blonde Boy. And in what must have been a conservator's nightmare, he took this and many other sculptures outside onto the site of the Acropolis to photograph them in a strong and overhead sun. So drawing on both the ideas of Wölfflin and Alois Riegel, and we have to also acknowledge inspired by Leni Riefenstahl's photographing of Greek antiquities on the Acropolis, he wanted to demonstrate how the statue was experienced aesthetically within its own time. So he argued that the strong overhead sun created the correct sense of contrast and shadow for the particular appreciation of this Greek sculpture and the intent of its sculptor or sculptors. So in the past 20 years, artifacts like the Blonde Boy have been scanned with processes such as laser scanning and photogrammetry, and then printed, as you can see on the right. So this is a photogrammetric model that you're seeing in the center, and a model made of it on the right, by an organization called Scan the World that Brendan Cormier has worked with quite extensively. And it was made from a 20th century cast of the Blonde Boy that's held in the Pushkin Museum on the left. So Scan the World would probably like to see the digital processes behind this reproduction as a major break in reproduction of artifacts. But we can also see this reproduction, this photogrammetric reconstruction and reproduction as something that has a 100-year history of reproductions embedded within it. Photogrammetry, as somebody mentioned earlier today, requires photographic images. And of course, these photographic images have been made of a plaster cast. So if anything, photogrammetry has made photography more central to the reproduction of cultural artifacts. And I should also add that the 3D print is very strong resemblance to plaster casts, and the way that it's particularly imaged in this case is reproducing early 20th century ideas of photography with painted black backgrounds. So somebody like Bruno Latour's ideas of co-temporality, the mixing of different genres of technological practice, is probably a more apt way to understand contemporary photogrammetric processes than is some major technological break. And this, of course, illustrates that point to some degree. So one of the areas that I think is very exciting in reproduction and that demonstrates how reproduction is always a translation of models involves polychromatic reconstruction. As the name Blond Boy suggests, the sculpture, like virtually every other antique Greek and Roman sculpture, was completely painted. So what we see here is a result of forensic explorations of the surface of the original sculpture, in which people find, archaeologist or someone running imaging equipment finds chemical traces of pigments, and then these very interpretive polychromatic reconstructions are made, usually involving plaster casts with hand painting. And they're provocative, at least to me, I think they're provocative because they're startling in their interpretations of what we otherwise consider to be monochromatic artifacts. And they also disturb our contemporary sensibilities regarding the mimetic quality of ancient art. And of course, as Jennifer Steger has pointed out in her own work, they disturb the disciplinary boundaries between sculpture and painting. So this was painted by Alphonse Neubauer of the Glyptothek in Munich. Okay, so that's a fairly quick tour of some thinking about reproductions and models. But I also want to also very briefly explore the idea of reproducing environment, which is a little bit more in my area of expertise. And I want to think about how I want to think through some various efforts to reproduce historic experiences of lighting for the viewing of artworks. And again, I apologize for the lack of contrast in the slides due to the illumination, but this is the situation. Okay. So the reconstruction of historic forms of lighting in museums can actually be traced to the origin of museums as they're known in the West, to some of the first public and national museums, as we have come to know this particular institutional form. And many of times these reconstructions of environment are ways to negotiate the physical and cultural displacement of artifacts. So one of the first museums of national art, Alexandre Lanoir's Museum of French Monuments, contained a series of rooms with artifacts rescued from forms of post-revolutionary, French revolutionary iconoclasm, as well as several plaster casts of in situ monuments. And each of the spaces had a particular light quality that was, created, that was achieved with curtains and colored glass that evoked a particular period or the sensibilities associated with a particular period. So the medieval room that you're looking on the left was supposed to be dark and gloomy, and as you headed into the room, into the sculptures of the Enlightenment, the museum became brighter as well, as a kind of analog metaphor. So sometimes the reconstruction of environments was about bridging geographical versus temporal gaps between an artifact in a museum and its original context. So in the 1930s, at Contemporary of Langlots, the art historian and curator Alexander Dorner explored the idea of what he called atmosphere rooms to aid the aesthetic understanding of fine art. In the Hanover Museum in Germany, and then at the Rhode Island School of Design, Fine Arts and Museum in Providence, he explored abstractions of particular aspects of context, color, light, sometimes sound and music, that would be introduced into the gallery. So on the left is his drawing for his restoration of the galleries at the Rhode Island School of Design, and where he wanted people to understand a Greek work of art, which he said were very often displayed outdoors against the intense blue color of the sky. So the idea was that the blue chromaticity of the room would be translated in some ways through color properties, et cetera, into the artifacts, would transform their coloration and hue. The reason I show the image on the right is that one of Dorner's critics, Theodor Adorno, argued that this creates a kind of melancholy effect of the artifact that makes us focus on its loss, whereas the museum is a way to get in touch with the aesthetic value of an artwork, and he argued the quote-unquote environment that a museum held in common among all of its diverse range of objects were their cash value, which is a very provocative idea about the meaning behind a museum. Okay, so this is just one, oh God, okay, now we're dealing with some real contrast issues. Okay, so as I mentioned, yeah, we really have to dim the lights. I'm sorry, because it's just gonna get darker and darker. In fact, the next project is about reproducing darkness. Okay, okay, so thank you. Okay, I appreciate that. It's still a little warm, but yeah. Okay, so a few years ago, the curator Charlotte Hale at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this is quite melancholy, arranged for Georges Seurat's The Circus to be relit with LEDs, and it simulated the chromaticity and flicker of gas lights in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So she was interested in the transformation of color that occurred in the gallery space when viewing this work, and I find the flickering a bit annoying, but the sensibility of the artwork and its coloration, of course, completely is transformed. Okay. So just moving along very quickly. So as I mentioned, my project entails historical and theoretical research into environmental reproduction as a concept. But it also entails my own exploration of reproduction techniques, both at my lab at CCA, a bit with some projects I've done for Brendan, and also now, of course, this new work that I'm about to undertake with Jennifer Steger. So what I call an environmental reproduction of a cultural artifact uses reproduction techniques, broadly defined, and environmental modeling, broadly defined, to collapse the distinction between an artifact and its surroundings. I'm after a representation of a thing and a representation of its ambiances and the ways that those two things can interfere with each other from a experiential point of view and also a disciplinary point of view. Reproductions are ways, I would argue reproductions are where disciplinarity is staged in addition to our writing. And the point of some of this project is to probe that a bit and see how we can think past that. So continuing with the theme of light. So a year ago, and this began with some provocations from Brendan, I explored how to environmentally reproduce this fairly odd artifact that you see on the left. This is a British reconstruction of a Roman copy of a Greek Lycipian Hercules from the 1st century. So I wanted to reproduce this artifact into the experience of night in the 18th and 19th centuries, the late 18th and 19th centuries. So the head of this bust was excavated in Pompeii in the 18th century. It was restored in Rome with an added bust and pedestal supports completely refabricated. So it's basically an 18th century neoclassical sculpture. And like many other antique museological artifacts, it has been displayed under virtually every form of pre-electrical light. Why am I interested in reproducing this into a certain form of light? It's well known that antique marbles were painted, and we went over this just a bit. But in the 18th and 19th century, antique marbles were also admired for the manner in which they became highly volatile artifacts. So John Ruskin is an art historian, poet, provocateur. We heard about him a bit earlier. He took the photograph in the middle. Ruskin wrote admiringly of the way marble took on what he labeled the golden stains of time through processes of weathering. In other words, marble was admired for the way it became dirty. And those with the means to collect and view them, to view antique marbles, often displayed them in contexts, such as one on the far right, that changed their chromaticity, such as this space with its yellow-tinted glass, the John Soane Museum in London. So when we uniformly imagine antique marble as white, we are engaging in a contemporary cultural attributions that, of course, has all kinds of racial and disciplinary overtones to it. But this is a cultural attribution that is physically reinforced with solvents, white plaster, 3D printing, a gallery's white walls, lighting, and acculturated forms of realist viewing, neoclassical aesthetics. We can go on and on and on. So my nighttime reproduction translated the marble into the reconstructed marble's chromaticity under candlelight, gaslight, hearthlight, and ambient moonlight. We should remember that before the electrification of cities, the ambient sky was much brighter at night than it is today, and there's many records of antiquarians admiring marbles at night. This was apparently, an actual thing. And just one other thing to mention, there's plenty of examples. I'll be done in a minute. There's plenty of examples of contemporary conservators, reproductionists, I'm not exactly sure what to say, environmentally reproducing artifacts into a form of light. But what I am interested in is in the multi-temporality, the multi-environmentality that can come by reproducing an artifact into as many possible environments as we can imagine, and enabling people to have that complex experience of looking through space, time, artifactuality when they're observing this thing. Okay, so a photogrammetric model created by Thomas Flynn was brought into the Unix-based Radiance platform, which was actually developed here at Berkeley, to create the re-imaged photos of the bust, designed for modeling light. This is a program that was designed for the use of architects to model energy during the energy crisis, but it's also used today because it can very accurately measure the chromaticity of various forms of historical light. I used numbers from for the values of the light's chromaticity from Alan Chalmers. Some of you know in the room is a British computer scientist who first sort of did this kind of work about 20 or 25 years ago. Okay, so these photos were then brought into a photogrammetric modeling program to create the model you see here. This embeds the colors, bakes them into the surfaces of the model, and enables us to create sensations of color that would be difficult to produce within a typical kind of artifact environment relationship that you'd have in a gallery. So the chromaticity, of course, transforms as you turn it. This was then printed in full 3D color on Gibson. I just have to say, of all of the reproductions you're going to see on the panel, this is probably the most modest in terms of its size and cost as well. Okay, so this printed in full color on gypsum at a low resolution to enable the coloration to come through more than the figuration. And compared, okay, anyway, so as you walk around the reproductions, this color obviously transforms. And the enlarged images show how we developed a system for printing the colors in the manner of a halftone screen. I'm not sure if that's coming through with the resolution of the projector and the brightness of the lights. So I did this to challenge some of the aesthetics of digital realism. I wanted this to look made, okay? And also what I like about this is that when you come within 3 feet of it, the surface of the sculpted form and the coloration cannot be visually resolved. They appear as independent things. So this is an artifact that offers a good bit of contingency in terms of the experience of form and color relative to the physical position of those who view it. So ultimately, these translations are as much about reproducing something from history as they are about creating an artifact self-evidently engaged with histories of reproduction and reproductions of environment. In other words, I don't think you can observe this reproduction and claim to have had an experience of its model, which as we know is sitting in a museum in London. But you can look at this and understand how any artifact moves through environments and how this might become embedded in reproduction practices. I like to think that there's a place for this work, and which is both a project of historical writing and us making historical artifact reproductions. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Next, I'm going to introduce Brendan Cormier of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Brendan is responsible for the curatorial development of the V&A Gallery in Shenzhen and its inaugural exhibition, Values of Design. As part of this collaboration, he co-curated with Luisa Mangoni the exhibition Unidentified Acts of Design, presented at the Hong Kong Shenzhen Urbanism, Architecture by City Biennale in 2015. Prior to his work on this project, he collaborated on a handful of international curatorial projects, including the first Iranian pavilion at the Venice Biennale of Architecture in 2014. He has also served as the managing editor of Volume magazine, an international quarterly publication about architecture and urbanism, and writes regularly for books and magazines on design and architecture. Welcome, Brendan.
Okay, hi everybody, and thanks so much for the nice introduction. I'm going to primarily talk today about an exhibition I did 2 years ago, which very much falls in line with a lot of the things we're talking about today, but almost embarrassingly seem a little bit dated already, which just goes to show you kind of how quickly things are moving. And so it's good to see newer projects by David, and then I think Adam will also be presenting some newer stuff. So I'm going to give you some really old 2-year stuff. So the exhibition was called A World of Fragile Parts, and it was at the Venice Biennale of Architecture in a new pavilion, the Pavilion of Applied Arts, which the V&A was asked to collaborate with the Biennale on. And so this was the inaugural show. And really briefly, the show looked at 3 things in general. One, which was to explore you know, a relatively forgotten 19th century moment where museums actively engaged in reproduction making in several different forms, but also how these reproductions accidentally or unintentionally became tools for preservation. And finally, moves on to look at digital reproduction technologies and ask the question what a 21st century cast court might look like. So this is what the V&A's cast courts look like. They are a bit of an accident of history because there was quite a lot of cast court production in the 19th century in museums across Europe and America. And when the 20th century came, many of these cast collections were destroyed or tossed out because they were seen to have no value anymore, which is a strange shift in attitudes and thinking of the role of the museum. But we kept ours, which is great. And this is just really quickly an image of what the exhibition looked like, so you know what it looks like. But at the center of this 19th century moment where we were building this cast court, so plaster cast reproductions, one of the most remarkable documents that comes from the V&A is this one document written by the founding director, Henry Cole, written in 1867, in which he sees a real need to promote the production of plaster casts and to make it easier in order to get access to other parts of the world. And he basically tries to come up with a convention which says, listen, we have museums, you have museums. This is talking to other countries and other princes and other countries. We have audience who want to see great works of art, and you as well. So why don't we allow each other to openly copy each other's works of art for the benefit of all of our audiences around the world, which is a remarkable document. It's 150 years old, and in a way, it's really talking about a lot of modern ideas about copyleft, open access, Creative Commons, et cetera, but in the space of architecture and plasta. And so you have this document that's written. It kind of unleashes quite a lot of plaster cast production activity. This is our Trajan's column under production. Old photos of some of the plaster cast workshops, some of the more colonial attitudes to plaster cast production. That's Henry Cole's nephew there overseeing production in India. And a lot of companies who actually start to emerge, and their entire job is producing these plaster casts for sale. And you have these wonderful catalogs with kind of disembodied figures floating over black space, which is, I think, really interesting. But it wasn't just plaster casts that were being produced at this time. It was also other kinds of novel 19th century technology. So this would be an Electra-type copy. And the museum commissioned a lot of these kinds of metal copies, which are made by dipping a mold into an electrolyte bath. And what's interesting about these is they really operate, a fellow curator of mine, he calls these 3D photographs, because what they do is they represent, purely in form kind of the object, but they take away all of its functionality. So you get this impression of a pocket watch without being a pocket watch. You have a sword, but you don't need the actual sword part, you just have the handle. And that's what it does. And then the third aspect of reproduction making at the museum, of course, was photography, which, maybe 10 years ago, we might not have thought of it in the same vein as a 3D model, but with the emergence of photogrammetry, we see now how photography can be the base unit for 3D files. And so we had this photography studio. It would go out and take pictures of great monuments. And of course, it's argued that photography killed the plaster cast primarily because you could store thousands and thousands of photographs in your museum, but you could only store a handful of plaster casts, which led to the plaster cast demise. But like I was saying, the accidental aspect about plaster casts is that because these plaster casts entered into museums, because they entered into a protocol in which you had conservators taking care of these objects, they started to, in a way, outperform many of their originals. So this bust that we see right here, that's a plaster cast copy of a bust that was sitting in Berlin in 1945. The museum in which it was situated was bombed. That bust was destroyed. And then you get this situation where there are many copies that exist in the world where their originals no longer exist. So this becomes the sole surviving kind of record of that object. Another accidental aspect of that, a rich aristocrat, a French aristocrat living in Cairo, decided he wanted to decorate his apartment with great Egyptian ornamental detail, went around making plaster casts of vernacular architecture, put it in his house. That vernacular architecture over the course of the 20th century through urbanization was destroyed, and now these become the remaining relics of that time period. And just another quick example of how plaster casts can capture moments of time, organic. These are life casts by Joseph Edgar Boom of famous individuals where you see the impressions of their hands. But I wanted to get to the actual contemporary side to understand kind of what is the possibilities of new technologies and what can we do that we couldn't do in the 19th century and what kind of effect that they had. So this show really operated as a kind of broad survey of different experiments in translating digital ideas into physical objects. So an attempt at a 21st century cast court. And here we get an example of a refugee shelter being turned into a stone monument. So what can you do with new technologies through photogrammetry? You can take material that you normally wouldn't be able to cast, soft, organic material, and then render that into a model and make it into something completely different. I also have to say that 2 years ago, this was the moment where, shortly after the attacks in Syria and Iraq of cultural sites by ISIS, so you had emerging at that time, and that's why it also feels slightly dated already. You had an emergence at that time of all these projects kind of claiming to do the impossible. So this was one of the more bizarre interventions in which the Institute for Digital Archaeology decided that they would bring the triumphal arch of Palmyra to Trafalgar Square, scaled down to 2/3 its side, and kind of do this dramatic unveiling in which Boris Johnson made reference to the Institute for Digital Archaeology by saying, let's all take our digits out and wave them to ISIS. So you can see how, like, the technology, it's kind of being weaponized and politicized in strange ways. But more interesting projects that focused on that, but explored the potential of new technologies. This one was called Project Mosul, in which these two guys kind of developed an algorithm which could scrape the internet of data. Any photograph geotagged Mosul would kind of arrive onto their hard drives, and then if they were able to find enough photographs of an object, they would feed it through photogrammetry software and kind of recreate these objects with certain limitations. But what's so interesting about that is it shows that the internet itself is now kind of a latent repository of potential 3D models. You know, there's so much photography on the internet that can be fed through software and turned into a 3-dimensional form. This is what David was talking about, Scan the World, a website that mobilizes a whole community of 3D hobbyists who kind of infiltrate museums, take pictures of their statues, and then turn them into monuments. A funny side note with this project, we actually met John from Scan the World as a potential person to 3D print some of our objects, not really knowing about his project, and it turned out he had already scanned 300 of our own statues at the museum without us knowing. So on one hand, you know, it's actually a wonderful development. It really democratizes the technology and puts it to the hands of anybody who's interested in it. I'm just going to go a little bit faster. I'll skip over a few. This project is by Morasheen Alahiari, where she was also interested in a lot of the destroyed artifacts from Mosul. Kind of hand models these based on old PDFs, so not using photo, kind of actually going to a much kind of older way of recreating models of things. But then embeds all the material that she used to recreate those models on a USB stick inside her model, so kind of implanting the DNA of an artifact within the artifact itself. This is one of the more infamous projects, the other Nefertiti, where two artists claim to have infiltrated the Neues Museum and taken a scan of the Nefertiti. They were very interested in the contradictions that the museum itself, while having several restitution claims over the bust of Nefertiti from Egypt, had produced a very high quality 3D scan of the object, yet was charging for it. So they were trying to make the statement that at the very least, if you have a digital replica, you should be able to release it online for free. And so that's what they did. They took their copy of it and they released it as a torrent. And then you had all these people kind of creating different objects out of that 3D model. So you had, you can imagine a pencil holder, you can imagine a pot, plants, and so on and so forth. This is, I don't know if Adam probably won't talk about this work in his presentation, so we can just show it right here. This is a work that, for me, really shows a lot of the potential, or is almost diagrammatic in the way it shows the effect of one piece through different materializations and different material renderings. And here it's kind of a process rendering, so you have a 3D print in the background, a wax positive in the middle, and then the final glass sculpture on the end. And David did a really interesting project which we didn't talk about now, which was saying, you know, we don't have to think about reproduction solely as physical things. We can talk about the reproduction of sonic environments. So every famous building you walk into has a unique acoustic imprint in it. And you can actually create impressions of those imprints, feed new sound through it, and recreate the effect of the sound of a space. And maybe this is the second to last project I'll show you. It's a project by Andreas Angelidakis. He's a Greek artist and architect who was an early adopter of 3D printing or 3D modeling. He made all of his models on an online platform. He woke up one day, that startup company had vanished, the website had vanished, and his entire database of 3D models also vanished. So since then, he 3D prints everything that he models. And his whole point is that the digital space itself is as vulnerable and as prone to becoming a ruin as any kind of physical space. So we can really go back and forth between digital and physical. Neither of them are indestructible. And what he does with this project is he goes into a space of digital ruin, which is Second Life. He builds something in that space, and then he materializes it here. So you see Second Life on the screen and the materialization in person. And this is just the last project I'll show you. This is a work by forensic architecture who normally do a lot of work analyzing sites of attack for human rights cases. They're able to triangulate plume clouds to locate them in a space and to identify the weapons used. And so they took that technology to look at the plume cloud itself as a kind of monument. So A.L. Weitzman's line was that all plume clouds are political monuments, monuments that last from 5 to 7 minutes. And so this was a kind of translation of the extremely ephemeral into a kind of diagrammatic view. And if you look at the second from the right, the smallest plume cloud over there, that's actually the plume cloud created from the bombing of Palmyra. And the other ones were kind of more regular kind of warfare activity from US, Syrian, and Russian aggressors. So it's kind of interesting how you get that diagrammatic effect of comparison. The last thing I'll just say is that last year was the 150th anniversary of that document that I showed you at the beginning of the project. So what we embarked on last year and what we involved a handful of people actually even in this room in were panel discussions with 4 partner institutions, the Smithsonian, the Louvre Abu Dhabi, the Palace Museum in Beijing, and the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, and attempted to collectively rewrite this document, this 1867 document, for the digital age. And we just released it in December, and you can go online. It's called The Reach Declaration, Reproductions of Art and Cultural Heritage, and it's a good read. Thanks a lot.
Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce the last speaker of this panel, and then we'll adjourn to our discussion. Adam Lowe of Factum Arte. Adam is the founder of the Factum Foundation and director of Factum Arte. He has been pioneering the application of technology to the recording of cultural heritage since 2001, when the first high-resolution laser scanning was carried out in the Tomb of Seti I. The work in Egypt has grown into the Theban Necropolis Preservation Initiative and led to the creation of the Center for 3D Scanning, Archiving, and Training. Lowe has been written about extensively, and the work he is doing to promote the Factum Foundation is known and respected around the world. He has written on the subject of originality and authenticity. He is an adjunct professor at the MS Historic Preservation at Columbia University, New York, and teaches and lectures widely in Europe and the US. He's also, and this was a comment at lunch too, that every time people were turning on the television, they were encountering Adam. He's featured in many television and radio programs and is currently completing a 7-hour series with Sky Arts that focuses on the recreation of 7 great works of art lost or destroyed in the 20th century. So, Adam.
It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a sort of lightning trip from Madrid for 24 hours in California, which yesterday seemed a step too far, but today it seems worthwhile. So thank you very much for asking me here. And I'm going to do what I like doing best, which is talking about actually what goes on in Factum's workshop as I left. So this is one of those PowerPoints that was put together incredibly fast. As I listened to this morning's talks, I thought really I should have focused on topography. So I think topography has been my obsession for years. Really everything we do is topographic. We're at the moment working on an innovative 3-dimensional model with back projection and front projection of Middle Earth for an exhibition of Tolkien, which I didn't show because I didn't have time to put the videos in. But last week I was in Moscow, and it's very interesting. We're missing on the. I don't mind the captions missing. basically we were recording Malevich's Black Square. So originality and reproduction and replication and authenticity are really the themes that we play with. But the image on the left shows the recording with a Lucida scanner, so a scanner we built in Factum. It's one of the things I'll come to as I try and do this whistle-stop tour of what goes on. But the Black Square is a painting I've wanted to record for years. After 2 years of negotiations with the Tretyakov, we were not only allowed to record the 1915 version, but also the 1929 version, which is on the right, so I'm not quite sure what's going on with the captioning. But the 29 version was made by Malevich as a replica of the first painting, because the first painting had cracked. What we're actually doing is a research project that's putting together X-ray, infrared, ultraviolet, 3D surface scanning, and high-resolution photography. So you'll be able to shift through them all and get a complete understanding of the difference between these two versions of the same square. So I'm not going to go into conceptual or art historical reasons for doing it, but there's a very important conservation reason. And most of what Factum Foundation's work is dedicated to is using the new technologies as a tool to preserve the evidence of the past. And in this case, there's a dialogue that's starting between the Tretyakov and the Stedelijk about how Malevich should be restored. And I think it's a very, very interesting issue of what should Malevich paintings look like. And for me, there's always a real concern about imposing our temporally located views on works of art in a way that they have to then bear witness to what we think rather than to what the object is. Also in Russia, we've been working extensively with the Perry Foundation. The Perry Foundation was the co-sponsors of the event at the V&A that Brendan was talking about a minute ago, the REACH project. And we've started on a number of things, but one of them that I think is of relevance now to the conversation about material replication is the work to record the monastery at Ferapontova, painted in 1502 by Dionisi. And in the first set of talks, there was a lot of recording being discussed, done with LiDAR scanners. LiDAR scanners are great tools. When they're used well, they can produce good data sets to view on screen, but not good data sets to replicate an object so side by side with the original it's convincing. So there's a big difference between virtual recording and reproduction and physical output. So plaster casting was really my obsession at the beginning. Recording the surface of paintings became my obsession. And again, I should probably just say in parenthesis that I, like one or two of the speakers this morning, are from a pre-digital world. And I realized very early on that it would be a total waste of my time to try and keep up with the younger generation now. So Factum is a workshop that pulls together about 50 different people with very different skill sets, from software writers to engineers to conservators to mold makers to architects and on and on and on, both to record objects and to replicate them. So today's hat, we're on replication. But the project here, and why I show this near the beginning, is I think the Ferapontova project is one that the data we have is staggering. It could lead to a replica. It could lead to a facsimile that would show just what an extraordinary painter Dionisi is. And one of the things that always puzzled me when we were recording it is that Dionisi painted it in 6 months with a group of painters. And because I'm very practical, I was worried about how he got all the pigment he'd need to cover all of these walls from Moscow up to the north of Russia, where Ferapontova is, knowing what they needed in advance. And the truth is, an awful lot of the pigments he was producing locally. While we were recording Malevich's Black Square, because the world is full of wonderful serendipitous connections, I happened to find the records in the Tretyakov storage to a restorer called Gusov, who was there in Felapontov. If we could just have the lights down for a second, because I mean, otherwise this annoys me, because you can't see what I'm going to say when it's like this. This is not a tomb in Egypt. This is in the Antiken Museum in Basel, and this is a facsimile of 2 rooms of the Tomb of Seti I, which I've been working on for the last 17 years. As my son always says, it makes me sound incredibly boring. But the truth is, recording the surface of this tomb and revealing why it looks like it does is really what Factum's foundation was set up to do. So the tomb was discovered in 1817 in perfect condition. We know that because there are watercolors showing it. About 10 years later, all the great Egyptologists in the world had hacked out bits of it. They'd made molds off the wall, and the tomb was reduced to a ruin of itself. So Champollion, Rossellini, I could go on. The names that we praise, and they're all great Egyptologists, so that's a secondary thing, but they weren't people who had the same relation to the material presence of an object as we do. So this is in the Antiken Museum in Basel. And what we've been able to do is record not only the tomb, and not all of it. It's an ongoing process that will take another 5 years, as long as the Egyptians let us back. But we've also been able to record the things that were taken out of the tomb. And in Sir John Soane's museum, which has cropped up once or twice, who we work with very closely on a number of different things, we recorded, so I first tried to do this in 2001 and we failed. We went back in 2016 and we succeeded. So we've recorded what is really the holy grail of Egyptology, the sarcophagus of Seti I, a large alabaster sarcophagus. And again, talking about preservation, when this was taken out of Egypt, it was white with blue infill. As you can see, it's now honey-colored with no blue. That's a long story. But what we were able to do is use the technology of today, which is in the video on the bottom left, to take the 3D photogrammetry data and print it using Osei's new laminar build. So basically, it's a color photocopier that builds in 5-micron layers to build up a physical object in full color. It's being developed by Osei in Holland at the moment. And this was one of those material things that allowed us to solve this problem. Originally, I wanted to make the facsimile of the sarcophagus in alabaster, but it was too complicated. It was also a bit too expensive. It required too many joins, and my conservators said they didn't have time to retouch them. So we had to find another solution. And the fact that basically color photocopies are thermally sensitive meant we could laterally rethink this and heat distort the 3D prints to fit onto a 3D milled substructure. So my real obsession is not only why things look like they do. These are 2 panels removed from the Tomb of Seti I. The one on the right is in the Louvre, restored in the 1990s, and the one on the left is in the Museo Archeologico in Florence, restored probably in the 1920s, although there are no records. Neither of these look like each other. They were facing pillars, they were identical, and neither of them look anything like the tomb. So again, trying to understand an object, which is why I like David's talk very much earlier, is very exciting. Now, linking to Brendan, because as everyone knows, this is a little riff and we all know each other rather well. This is our recording from Mosul, which is very, very different. In fact, it's not, of course. It's our recording from the British Museum. They wouldn't let us go to Mosul at the time in 2006 when I did this. But these are the Lamassu currently on show in Leiden. In fact, they finished last week, so they're not anymore. They're heading back to our workshop in Madrid. And this is really the new drive of what Factum's doing at the moment. So these Lamassu, which are made in scagliola, so they're made in a material, something like plaster, but with pigment and animal glue, to simulate the Mosul marble from which the originals were made. And again, it's worth noting, when these were brought to the British Museum, they were fully polychromed. They were cleaned in the 19th century to reveal them as they are. But we're now sending these back to Mosul in a project we're doing with the University of Mosul and with a number of people who are trying to save the fragments in Nimrud. We're going to set these up in the Ashurbanipal Library Project in Mosul, and we're training a team of students from Mosul University to do high-resolution photogrammetry. This is really the what can we give back was a question that came up this morning, and digital assets or this kind of thing. What we can give back is we can give back the technology and the training and the skill and the support to enable the economy to be moved locally and not taken outside in a very colonial approach. In a very colonial approach, well, actually, this is post-colonial. We sent a team out to Nigeria in 2016 to record bottom left the remaining icon monoliths from the Cross River State, which my generation knew better as Biafra because all the images of the Civil War haunted my childhood. In fact, in 1968, top left, the monolith looked like that. Because one of the chiefs, and local knowledge is critical, told us the top half was in a famous museum. It didn't take very long to identify the top half, top right and bottom right, as being in the Met. We persuaded the Met to join in the project with us, and we recorded the top half and the bottom half, and we basically have now rejoined those two digital objects, one in America and the other on site. But the goal is really to try to persuade the local chiefs the importance of 3D recording in the long-term preservation of the remaining monoliths so they can be used to encourage tourism at a time when Nigeria, when this part of Nigeria, it's on the Cameroon border, it's more or less in civil war at the moment, so it's very tricky. So topography, we do get there eventually. This is the Hereford Mappa Mundi that we recorded in a project because Hereford, on the Welsh border in England, is the home of the Royal College for the Blind, and we were asked if we could make a tactile version of the Hereford Mappa Mundi so the blind and partially sighted could feel it. So this is the recording, color and black and 3D on the right. This is the facsimile, where the color and the 3D are mapped together. We finished the facsimile last week. The monochrome facsimile has been in the cathedral for a year and a half, and it's a wonderful object now where you can see where people have been touching and feeling. But while we were recording, and again, this is really the importance of physical copies. It's the importance of the collection in the V&A. It's the importance of plastercasts. They give you time, both in the recording and in the making, to reflect on why the object looks like it does. And for me, this is absolutely critical to everything that's going on. So while we were in Hereford, again, local knowledge is essential, and it's not the people who are being published or speak loudest, but Rosemary Furman, who's the archivist in Hereford Cathedral, whose husband is blind and publishes music for the blind, said, Adam, I think you'll find the secret lies in the backboard. So we also scanned the backboard, and if we can prove that the map was drawn on the backboard, it will mean we can completely accurately date the map and its place of origin, its place where it was painted. So watch this space. I think we can change the early history of this map. Changing the history of things is a very, very important thing. So actually developing a new generation of digital connoisseurship. This is Goya's famous, one of the black paintings of the dog on its side, that we scanned all of the black paintings. Again, all I'd say here is the brief was really to say how much of the black paintings were painted by Goya, or were they all painted by Goya? Or if you could get high-resolution recording in color, in 3D, that you can zoom into and look at 5 to 10 times magnification, can you start to see why the nose looks like it does, and can you spot the damage? Can you cross-refer those in layered archives with X-ray, with infrared, with historical photos? And can you understand why these paintings, and why these paintings look like they did when they were on the wall of a house that Goya bought as a property development in the suburbs of Madrid and didn't live in? So what happened to these? What's the early history of them? Why do they look like they do now, when in Lauren's photos taken in the 1860s, they don't look like they look in the museum today? So there's a lot of discussion. Really I'm going to try and finish very quickly, but really the key to what we're doing is, and again, I like some of the morning's conversation, is if you're developing your own equipment, controlling it, writing your own software, you actually know what it does. And I think mediation, which was a word that was mentioned a lot, must go all the way down and all the way back up. So you have to know every stage of what's being done. This is what we call the Veronica scanner. And again, I love the fact that new technologies are never new. So we all talk about photography as if it's image-based, and then suddenly there's photogrammetry. There was photogrammetry in 1852 and 3D output in the same period. So new technologies are not new, they've just become faster, and we can do things like you saw with the OSE printing that was not possible a few years ago. So there are things that are new, but the technologies themselves not. The Veronica scanner, this one very quickly was done following a conversation I had at a dinner in Milan with an aesthetic surgeon, when I asked him who taught aesthetics to aesthetic surgeons, because I didn't have a problem with what they were doing. I had a problem when it was done badly. And I think quality assessments are actually very important. So this morning's discussion about subjectivity, really it's about whether something's done well or done badly. So there's a lot of bad work going on with new technology at the moment, being disguised as being significant, which it isn't. And like the painting of the blonde boy is some of the worst I've ever seen. And I remember a great privileged moment seeing a polychromed a medieval stone piece that had been walled up in Tudela Cathedral, and it's one of the most beautiful objects in the world, and it doesn't look like Warhammer. So people doing polychroming now seem to do it terribly. Really winding up even faster. Building systems to record archives fast at high resolution with metadata tags. Mark, very important, we all agree. So you have a full record of everything. This is a project we're doing with the Fondazione Giorgio Cini. We've recorded 700,000 double-sided images with metadata tags at A3 at 1:1 at 700 DPI in 12 months with 2 part-time operators. This is a book scanner we've built that's working in Dagestan, where we're recording the state archives. We've got the team in the state archives on site in Dagestan, and with remote access, we're controlling, checking, modifying the software, supporting them while they're working in Makhachkala. And just to finish, because there was a good plug, Sky Arts are about to do 7 hours of television programming on 7 paintings that were destroyed. So I'm going to do this almost without too many words, but one of them is a Monet. The others are all very different. A Monet that was destroyed in a fire in 1958 in MoMA. The only thing that existed was a black and white photo, but because serendipity runs everything, I was teaching at Columbia, and I met a conservator from NYU, and I said I was looking for the painting because I'd heard the painting, even though it's heavily smoke damaged, painting on the left, still existed. And Michel said, yes, Adam, it's in my office. And so we then recorded the painting in 3D and in color. We then 3D printed the surface. We were able to do color extract from the smoke damaged surface, the color of the original surface, put the two together, and the final facsimile is currently hanging on display in Rome in an exhibition of Monet's Nymphaeus. So there's a number of things where copying is really closing the gap. And very often, all you're left to confront is your own prejudice about which is more important. And actually, if you read it as evidence into a historical mindset to read and understand an object, then I think the new technologies are giving us the tools to radically change connoisseurship and art history. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, thank you to all three of you. That was very exciting, and you can see how all of your work really fits together. I was struck, Adam, by your phrase, closing the gap, to sort of think about this practice of replication and themes that reverberated through all three talks of experimentation, replication, preservation, authenticity, and as well as this ongoing movement between digital and physical worlds, which I think also were quite present in this morning's talks. I'm wondering if you guys could lead off by thinking through how you negotiate between the act of making something, which then becomes an object in the world, even a digital making, right? It becomes its own argument out in the world, versus sort of analysis of the object or its historical circumstances, et cetera. So I know, David, for example, you've said that you don't want to make art objects. But at some level, any replication is a making. And Brendan, you drew our attention to the fact that sometimes those replications are what we have. And so it's always out there in the world making an argument, taking a stand in some ways, and that has an impact on how we experience them, think through them, et cetera. So.
Well, if I was going to try and build a bridge to the first talks this morning, when you're using the technology, there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of skills, a lot of understanding that's needed to record great data. Going to the plaster cast collection at the V&A or looking at 18th or 19th century plaster casts, there's a vast amount of skill in making a plaster cast. So there's good plaster casts and bad plaster casts. There's hand-finished plaster casts. So for me, the great moment was, actually we were in Bologna and I was in the Gyptoteca in Bologna, but it could have been in any, was I'd always assumed a direct contact that's actually harming the object was going to be better than anything we could achieve with a 3D scanner. But the truth is there's so many steps in making a mold, in making a piece mold, in joining them together, in casting that might be commercial, they might be practical, they might be to do with materials, they might be to do with where you're working, if it's in a market square or whatever. And the removing with an adze of the lines in a piece mold changes the surface. So plaster casts are very good with some caution of describing shape, but they don't describe surface. What I think has happened in the recent technology is we can now record shape and surface. And it's still amazing that I think it's true to say there isn't a museum in the United States that's recording the surface of paintings systematically before and after restorations, when every single museum should be doing it as a matter of course.
You know, when I hear that question, I think about something that I struggle with in my own work, and also something that I've been thinking about watching the presentations. So when I think about the kind of virtual world and the actual making of artifacts, I think of it in a slightly different manner, in which in watching the talks and thinking about my own practices, I think about the virtual world of historiography and art historical practice and the objects that those of us are interested in making, how those relate back to it. So for example, you know, my art historian friends always comment that so much of digital reproduction has to do with details and biography and things that are not so important in contemporary forms of art historiography. So I am curious, like, how the scanning and the reproductions that we make with these tools connect to insights, art historical insights in the directions of art history. Right now, I think there's two different paths. There's two different paths at the moment, and I do wonder how they intersect. Right?
Well, I mean, one of the places where they're intersecting very, very clearly. So I showed an image about what we're doing with the Fondazione Cini in Venice, which is actually linked up with École Polytechnique Fédérale in Lausanne. And Frederick Kaplan, who I actually first worked with in 2000 on a computer vision project, is developing an intelligent computer vision software, particularly to feed a project that he's doing with Isabella Di Leonardo called the Venice Time Machine. So it's worth looking at what they're attempting to do, which is to build a retrospective 4D map of Venice from the archive, the information in the state archives. And we recorded the photo archive of the Chini. And one of the things that's happened very quickly is the software can now do the first layer of analysis. We found that 7% of the archive was miscatalogued. I mean, that's quite important. You find a whole lot of things that you'd never have spotted because they're stored in different parts of the archive because they're attributed to different painters. But for me, much more excitingly, we found a whole group of pictures that the computer was identifying as being different, but to the naked eye looked identical. And the more you look, it's a sort of spot the difference thing. The more you look, you could start to see there are very subtle differences. So El Greco, without doubt, was using copying systems within his workshops. And the way workshop practice will be seen to be different, to me, is incredibly exciting. There were examples coming out of Holland of the same thing, where the changes are so subtle but very significant. And then, of course, you're getting the next level, where restorations are bringing about dramatic changes in pictures, both in chromatic terms but also in composition. So I think it's going to change art history fundamentally.
I want to give Brendan you a chance to respond, but I did just want to add that I think underlying David's comment in a way is that no matter what shifts in technology, or maybe even as a result of ongoing shifts in technology, you know, the underlying questions that we want to ask are still going to differ from discipline to discipline, from practice to practice, from individual within a discipline. And that's some of the territory that we're negotiating. It's not just what technologies to use and how should they be used, but what questions are we asking them to do.
Very quickly, just as an example of what I'm talking about. So one of the art historical figures that I'm obsessed with is Alois Riegel, who has this theory that that vision changes historically from society to society, geographically, temporally, whatever. So there's an inaccessibility of us to be able to see as somebody saw, you know, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, 100 years ago. And yet at the same time, he thought that, and in his own practices, manipulating reproductions in his own art historical writing, which he did very willfully, cropping, editing, changing things to represent how he believed contemporary seeing in his own time, 1909, could reach back in time and not see as somebody did, but acknowledge that we see differently. So I think that's what I'm talking about, that you can't make a Velasquez or an Egyptian monument or any artifact appear as someone saw it another time, because vision is a fundamentally different concept now. But admitting and acknowledging that difference is exciting, and nonetheless trying to understand how we can create bridges to the past is important. Yeah. Sorry.
I don't know where to go from there.
Sure. Well, I was just going to think, in a way, what you're saying connects with Adam's idea of the gap.
Yes.
Just a different way of,
No, I would add, I mean, just from a curatorial perspective, you're constantly thinking about what an object is communicating in a very direct way. And there is a kind of semiology of materials and production methods which signal to the audience immediately whether or not they should care for looking at something or not looking at something. So we have this dialogue a lot in the museum where if we want to do a reproduction of a 2D thing in our collection, first of all, it's very much frowned upon because, I mean, it's still, like most museums, thrives on the idea of the original object, even if it's a photograph. And so the response would be to kind of, if you wanted to show an object but you couldn't bring the photograph for whatever reason, you'd do an industrial print using a bog standard kind of material and technique to signal very clearly that's not an authentic object. But at the same time, they're miserable to look at. They're not interesting whatsoever. And so as an audience person, you just kind of skip over it and go to the juicier stuff. So I think that's a really funny dilemma within curating and exhibition making, which is how much kind of sleight of hand do you want to introduce in order to get somebody to pay attention if something is not the original. And I think your work very much touches on that.
Well, the exhibition in Basel basically sets up a reconstruction of the so-called Hall of Beauties based on the forensic evidence we have, the three-dimensional data and all the watercolors. You're led through a whole lot of different ways of looking at both the fragments that were removed as original fragments and as copies. And for me, there was very rarely you get the chance to do this, because I mean, museums condition the way we look. I mean, that's just a fact. Whether we see differently, I think Riegel actually kind of questions his own argument, because I think an object allows us to get inside the mindset of the people who made it and all the decisions that were made while it was being made. And that's why restoration is so problematic, because they're adding new layers on top, which reflect about the time the restoration was done and the place the restoration was done, rather than the object itself. So I love multiple complex biographies, but I do think this question about whether we actually see differently or whether we're just framing what we see within a different context. So I would suspect it's the latter. And you know, whether we're working with things like the Kochno stone that were done 5,000 years ago, I think you can gradually understand what this object is saying through a close, and you have to spend time. So I mean, what is it, the V&A, the average time spent on an object is 14 seconds or some figure. I mean, in 14 seconds, you're not going to see anything. That's, I mean, nothing.
I think just really very, very quickly, I just think it's important to acknowledge, when I use the term see differently, I mean it from purely socially and culturally point of view, not a biological perspective, right? Okay,
right.
Yes.
Yes.
Just want to be very clear about that.
I was going to say, I think you're both actually saying the same thing. I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience in the interest of sticking to our time, and then, okay, go ahead.
Very interesting talk, really, really enjoyed. I have one question for all of you. So, we already experienced cast copies, you know, from the 19th century and whatever. And it's interesting because Benjamin already discussed these things of the soul of an object, originality. Now, the thing is, these objects, actually at the beginning were replicas, but today are not any longer really replicas, because a generation of people have been studying using these objects, and they create really engagement with it. And actually, they're not any longer replicas, because actually institutions put a lot of money for restoring them. So, because those represent an important, as Cornelius will say, an object can gain heritage as far as actually it gets past. My question is, if you actually have the possibility, you know, you put a lot of efforts in reprinting, designing, understanding, would you one day eventually reprinting or restarting from scratch, or would you allow to restore your object?
That's a question to me. More or less the way I normally answer that. Benjamin always comes up in these talks, and for me, you know, he was working at a time when he was a man of culture and taste and knowledge, who was arguing a communist position and knew that the reproductions were second rate. It's as simple as that. So he comes up with a quasi-religious notion of an aura to account for the difference, and now everyone just cites back aura all the time. I mean, we don't ever try and fake historicize something. And so I think that the easiest way to answer the question is we often get people saying, you know, Adam, why don't you make it as it was? And I say, well, that's rather like you asking me to paint your portrait when you were 7. You know, I could imagine what you looked like when you were 7, but it would be a subjective and a creative task. So I do love doing it. I loved trying to remake the Hall of Beauties. But that's about trying to get someone into a mindset of how they're going to engage with everything else. So it's setting something up.
But would you recognize the fact that your reproduction will age? And so that is an important thing, I believe.
Our reproductions age. Okay, of course they do. Every object ages, every person ages. Time is going to go on until it stops.
So I have a question. What if the imaging that is revealed completely changes the experience or the meaning of the painting? And my example is a 18th century Spanish still life painting, quite austere, a pile of reflective copper pots, a pile of cheese, discolored varnish. And in the imaging of it, it turned out that in the murk, there was the ghost of a mouse. And that's why the edge of the cheese was uneven. What do? Do you recreate? I mean, the mouse was fugitive. It had been there and had faded over time, the pigments. What do? And having the mouse completely change the experience of the painting.
I mean, if I was going to answer that, the beauty of digital technology is you can make a digital virtual facsimile or a physical one with the mouse or without. So you don't have to act on the original to do a subjective interpretation of the present. So I could make you an exact copy. I mean, so one of the things that we do is for museums, for collections, for exhibitions, make exact copies. So I could make you an exact copy with the mouse. I mean, that would take time. You'd need digital restoration, but you'd then have the two side by side, so you could see what you want to see, but you'd still have the painting as the painting is.
Although that does connect a little bit to the question with which I led, in which your version with the mouse becomes an object in the world that impacts some interpretation of the painting. And so it's acting on us, no matter what. Yes.
Yeah, no, I think you've just touched on one of the great aspects of what the technology can do right now. I mean, there's tons of, I think they were talking about Rembrandt paintings recently, and you know, being able to reveal at what point, you know, he drew a figure and then erased it and then put it in a different part of the painting. So you can start to unveil processes, you can start to understand how an artwork was made, and through a digital reproduction.
The black square has two paintings underneath the first black square, so we'll be able to reveal both of those.
There's one going around the audience. Are you ready for? We have three between us.
Yeah, we're fine. You know, one person I find instructive with these kinds of questions, I'm just laughing. All of us have been on panels before, and I think, you know, Adam, right, reacts has the strongest reactions to resurrecting these modernist figures. And I know you're trying to think past them, but somebody who I find very exciting is Cesare Brandi, the Italian art conservator, who always believed that artworks existed in three times, right? The time of their creation, the temporal gap between when they're created and now, and then contemporary restoration efforts. And in his own restoration practices, he always tried to enable his work, you know, the people working with him, tried to enable a viewer to understand all three temporalities at once. So he had this system called trategio with like little, maybe you know this, little hatches to infill the damaged portions of paintings, so that from a distance they would look complete, but as you came closer they'd look different. So I love that idea of multi-temporality, and I think that's really critical, especially in a time when images are circulating freely to those who have access to computers and the internet, and might look at a scan of the blonde boy, for example, and think it was of the original when it was actually of a cast in Moscow, right? So I think that this idea of multi-temporality, I think, is very critical right now.
It seems like you tried to address that in your light condition.
Actually, David Gissen's just brought up what I was going to sort of interject here. I've worked with, it's about reproductions of sculpture, right? I've worked with casts ever since I was an undergraduate at Cambridge in the late 1960s at the Museum of Classical Archaeology. And we still use them in the Athenian Agora, where Rebecca and I work in the summers, of sometimes parts of the statues that we deal with that are in other museums. However, I think probably for the audience, it must be understood that all of the reproductions of sculpture that I saw, and I may be corrected, are not copies, they are representations. They are on different supports, that is to say, your plaster casts by definition are not on Pentelic marble, or Parian marble, or Carrara marble, or limestone, and I could go on for quite a long time on that basis. And this other thing may be corrected at some point. They do not show the detail of the original. And I don't mean that horrendous one that you showed from Scan the World of the blonde boy, where all of the detail in the hair was lost. I mean, even down to getting every lock correct, the rasping, the work with emery abrasives and so forth, which is vitally important in terms of texture, is not shown. When the sculptures are colored, and I quite agree with all of you, they look even more horrendous than some of the casts do, because reproducing ancient earth tone paints, plus their effect on media like marble, where yes, the crystalline structure does show through. It is not the same as painting, even faux marbre, which has no proper crystalline structure, does not show through. So, I mean, while we use plaster casts, they must not be taken as substitutes for the originals. They are not. They're aide-memoire. They help you to remember at least what some of the originals look like, some parts of the originals look like. They also can help, again, in the formal structure, the composition, for example, of a statue. But we're in this kind of twilight zone. And the twilight zone is a very big one. And I think a lot of people, particularly when they see, scan the world, oh, wow, okay, we got them all. What do we need the originals for? I mean, that's very crude. Yeah. But
I mean, I don't think we're in a twilight zone. I think we're in a dawn. So the light is coming. I can tell you that most of the things you're looking at, so Scan the World, it's why we keep going back. Those are just bad copies. Okay, there's nothing more to be said. The Arch of Palmyra is one of the most shameful acts supported by universities.
I'm very glad you said that.
So, no, it's a total disgrace. And the fact that it was shown, it was talked about uncritically. So for me, what this reveals is how little people look. But in answer to your question, we can now work in original materials. We can record, so with the British Museum, we did a demonstration last year with the statue of Idrimi, which I mean is 1500 BC, with his biography written on his chest in minute cuneiform. I've got everything down to the beginning and end of the minute cuneiform so that experts can study and read it better than they can on the original sculpture. What we've got, because you can magnify it, you can look at it in different ways, you can move the lighting around. So what Chicago House was doing in terms of epigraphy, you can do much better now than you could using previous methods. So actually, I think the technologies are moving very fast that will lead to new levels of understanding.
This is one of the points of contention between me and Adam in some respects, because I like to always go back to the idea that like I said earlier, every mode of representation, every material, every production technique communicates something differently. So nowadays, I don't think we would get really hard on a photocopy and be like, can you believe it, that photocopy is not doing what it should be doing, it's not an accurate representation. No, it's not. It is a reproduction technique that communicates a very specific idea about what a photocopy is. And no one's expecting that to be a perfect quality. So I do, on the other hand, kind of find some charm in something like Scan the World, which is low resolution, which is done as a DIY thing. It is not making any claims to be close to original. But it has its own qualities, which are highly important. And one of those qualities is, how do you communicate an idea? So a plaster cast court, it was about communicating an idea to an audience who couldn't afford to travel to the originals. And all of these have their different modes of communicating those ideas, and they communicate it through different resolutions, they communicate it through different aesthetics. And we can't hold a high watermark that everything has to be as close to the original as possible. It's great when they are, and it can yield different results, but we have to take it on a case-by-case example with different materials and production techniques. So I liked the Palmyra Arch in Trafalgar Square. I thought it was funny.
I don't engage in this discussion.
Hi, thank you for such an interesting panel. As someone who is often involved in grant writing and who is asked also to comment and compare on Google, it's been fascinating to me that today no one has brought up what Google is doing with art recording and preservation. I wonder if any of you would like to comment on the technology, the quality, the aims of what Google is doing, say with its Bruegel project or others.
I mean, the Bruegel project is very interesting. I mean, so having lots of money means that you in a way buy the publicity. So for me, the real issue of what we were doing with Reach was focusing on digital recording, digital archiving, and access. With Google's relationship with the Rijksmuseum, there were a lot of things that came up. So Google owns the copyright on the data that it's recording. If they didn't want that, they should ascribe it to the museums, because I believe very strongly that the museums or the custodians of the object should be the people who benefit from any future revenue that might be derived from that object. So, I mean, if Google didn't want that data, then it's a very simple thing to ascribe it to the museums, but they don't. And also, Google's stitching is rather weak.
The Google Cultural Institute has made no claim for archiving or preservation of this data, so they're collecting a lot of stuff that's entertainment for us right now today, with absolutely no commitment to the future of this data.
That's absolutely true.
We probably have time for one more question.
I was actually going to ask a copyright question, so that was a nice little segue. Is it part of the conversation where we were talking about people coming in and not knowing that like low-res scans were being taken? Is the copyright of those images, because the museum, if they have their paperwork together, should own those images? Is that part of the conversation?
It's a huge part of the conversation. I mean, it actually, what it does in a really effective way is it blows open a kind of hypocrisy in a lot of museums which own lots of public domain works and who have photography of those works and don't allow those works to be given out for free. So what you're doing is, in our museum, for example, photography is allowed, well, actually, technically, it's not allowed if it's a work in copyright, which makes it really weird. But we encourage photography. But the moment you realize that a photograph then can be turned into a three-dimensional work, challenges your idea of what is allowed. But of course, it has to be allowed technically because that three-dimensional work is just made up of a bunch of photographs.
I mean, for me, I just smiled. So the the Nefertiti piece that you saw earlier, I mean, they didn't record the data with the camera system that everyone did. So it goes viral on Google, everyone believes it. So it goes back to this thing. There's a sort of gullibility that goes with this. But I mean, for me, the critical thing, and again, with an institution like the Met that's recently changed its policy, you have on one hand the copyright department that's busy trying to protect their assets, and on the other hand, you have the marketing department that's busy trying to get lots of people to come to the museum. The copyright department is a loss-making department, and the other one has a big budget, which is being castrated by the copyright department. So if you get rid of the copyright, many more people access the museum's digital assets, a term I hate, but it's come up several times today, access the objects digitally. That tends to lead to more visitors, which means the shop tends to make the revenue that the copyright department wasn't making. So the museums are moving to realize that it's in their interest to have a global audience rather than just a local one. Many of that global audience will never go to the museum, but they need to know and have access to the high resolution files.
We were together on a panel in Washington. Actually, I think Brendan and Adam arranged, and there was a professor, Sandra, from university. Right. Yes. Yes, and she gave a very interesting warning to the euphoria in the room around the digital distribution of artifacts around the world, which is that, you know, the digital distribution of cultural artifacts in museums largely reflects demographically the population currently that can afford to visit the museums, and it's very unevenly distributed, right? So there's entire parts of the world that have no access to these digital imagery, and so the question is whose culture is getting distributed, who decides which aspects of whose culture gets imaged in the first place, and how we need to question that. And she gave a very fascinating overview of a project where she asked her students to go document areas of Mexico City that they considered aspects of their cultural history under her supervision, obviously. And then those things were distributed, right? So it was a way to bring a larger cultural sphere into what we consider, you know, very different than all of the objects that you've seen here today, right? So, and very like a provocative and teachable lesson, I think, for all of us. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
Okay.